Cybersecurity cannot ignore climate change, so sit back and enjoy.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloé Messdaghi, and today we're going to talk about cybersecurity cannot ignore climate change. And this is going to be a very quick talk, and we're going to really focus and dive into why we are even talking about this in the first place. So let's do this. For those that don't know who I am, my name is Chloé Messdaghi, and I'm the founder and principal of Impactive Consulting. And what I do is I help organizations and security teams become more, trustworthy. Also, I help mitigate risk and drive purpose. So basically what I do is I'm a strategist. I help companies grow and to really figure out what are the things that are holding them back from growing. And that includes also how do you help your security teams and how do you do better practices on security teams to make sure that you're retaining them, but also they feel empowered and they feel like you're investing in them, which is needed. I'm also the co-founder of We Open Tech and also the co-founder of Open Tech Pledge, a podcaster for ITSP Magazine's a change-making podcast. And yes, I have a book coming out with Wiley that will also touch on this subject that we're going into today. So let's get into the details. Let's talk about our planet's status. So overall, this is going to be grim, but at least we know the information to be able to make change. But what you should know is that sea levels are rising and oceans are becoming warmer. And also we're having longer and more intense droughts that are threatening crops, wildlife, fresh water supplies, from those polar bears that we always see in our head. And when we see it, we get a little bit sad. It's hard, right? You also have the marine turtles that are off the coast of Africa. Overall, our planet's diversity of life is at risk because of the changing climate at this time. And at this time, we are looking at 1/3 of all plant and animal species to be extinct in 50 years. This was a study that was done by PNAS. Go check it out. But it is one of those things that when you read it and you see it on the screen, it does impact you a little bit. But overall, the Australian think tank IEP also predicts that at least 1.2 billion people could be displaced by such climate-related events by 2050. And we have plenty of these evidence, as we have seen over the year, such what happened in Germany and the flooding. We also have seen that when it comes to the droughts, the high heat that we experience across Europe and in the US, even in Canada. But we've also seen what could also happen when displacement is going to occur. So for example, the majority of 30.7 million people were actually displaced in 2020 alone. And this was due to fleeing from floods, wildfire, drought, or heat waves. But also this was a report that was released by the International Federation of Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. And this image that you're seeing was taken in 2017 when about 1/3 of Bangladesh itself was underwater due to floods devastation, which actually forced people to relocate and become climate refugees. In Bangladesh alone, it is predicted that 17% of the country will be submerged by the rise of sea level by 2050. That means about 20 million people living there will lose their homes. And today, many people in developing countries are suffering from droughts, windstorms on a scale never seen before, depriving them of their daily food and basic needs. The term climate refugees was first coined to describe the increasing large-scale migration and cross-border mass movements of people that were partly caused by such weather-related disasters. In the US, we saw that with people from Central America trying to cross the border because of the drought situation. And of course, we also have fires. Y'all remember the fires across California, possibly? I mean, I live in California. I remember the day when I opened my blinds and I saw that everything was orange around me. I felt like as if I walked on Mars. It was incredibly surreal and also very, very scary. And in the US right now and around the world, we're experiencing drought in several different places. And over the past 20 years at this time, the researchers found that a 1 degree Celsius, which is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, increases in mean summer temperature increases the risk of fire starting on any given day, either by human activity or a lightning strike, by 19 to 22%, and has now increased that burn area by 22 to 25%. And it's not just that we have to worry about when it comes to fires. An analysis of satellite imagery from the past 4 decades has suggested that global warming has increased the chance of storms reaching Category 3 or higher, as we have seen recently with Hurricane Ian hitting Florida and other areas. And melting glaciers add to that rising sea level, and which in return increases that coastal erosion and elevates storm surges, as that warming air and ocean temperatures create more frequent and intense coastal storms like hurricanes and typhoons. And from data from NASA's GRACE project, we've also been able to track Antarctica, the mass. But overall, in Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are losing significant amounts of land-based ice as a result of human-caused global warming. And now let's go into deeper about what's going on in our waters. So at least 14 million tons of plastic ends up in our ocean every year. And plastic makes up about 80% of the marine debris found from surface waters to deep sea sediments. Marine species actually ingest this or get entangled by plastic debris, which causes severe injuries and death. But you're also eating it too if you eat fish. So that's good for you. You're basically eating a plastic amount on a weekly basis of a form of the same amount as your credit card. So you know you have credit cards or debit card. Yeah, you're digesting about one of those per week at this time. Lots of fun, right? It's in your water too. And if you're not aware of like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it is part of a 5 offshore plastic accumulation zones in the world's oceans and is located halfway between Hawaii and California. It covers an approximately surface of 1.6 million square kilometers, an area that's twice the size of Texas. And if you don't know about Texas, the state, and how big it is, how about this way? Think about France. Now imagine 3 of France's in one place. Yeah, that's basically, it's pretty massive. It's estimated that it's between 1.15 million to 2.41 million tons of plastic that are entering our ocean each year from rivers. And for those that aren't aware, fun fact, not really fun fact, but it takes about 400 to 1,000 years for plastic to decompose. And that's an estimation. We actually we've never seen it decompose naturally on its own for human existence, because plastic hasn't been around for that long, nor has research on this subject been around for so many years to be able to track it. So this is an estimation. And some say that it actually could take more than 1,000 years. And this is just like the most minimum way of figuring out how many years it will take for plastic to decompose. And about things to note is about 66% discarded paper and cardboard is usually recycled. 27% is glass, 8% are plastics that are actually recycled. The reality is that we don't really know how to recycle plastic around the world. So glass and metal can be recycled indefinitely. Paper can be recycled about 5 to 7 times before it's degraded to what would be made into new paper, for example. But plastic can only be recycled maybe once or twice, and especially if there's food in the container, it will not be processed at all because the polymers break down in the recycling process. And now we're going to get into the bit about your health and how climate change plays a role. Now, the thing to note about the root causes of climate change is that it also are the reasons why we're going to see more increases of pandemic risks. one of the contributing factors for such things is deforestation, which occurs mostly for agricultural purposes, is the largest cause of habitat loss worldwide. Loss of habitat forces animals to migrate and potentially kind of contact other animals or people, and then they share germs. And then you have large livestock farms can also serve as a source for spillover of infections from animals to people. If, for example, preventing deforestation, that root cause of climate change, can help stem biodiversity loss as well as slow that animal migrations that can increase that risk of infection, disease, and spread. So having a less demand for animal meat, because most of the deforestation is also happening for the purposes of, having cattle on land. But also one thing to note is that having more sustainable animal like husbandry, I think that's how you pronounce the word, could actually decrease the emerging infectious disease risk and lower greenhouse gas emissions. And for those that don't know what makes up the greenhouse emissions, it is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. So that's 4 things that make up greenhouse gas emissions. And you may actually see it also as GHG, by the way. And one of the things of example of where we're seeing this besides COVID-19 is that the recent Ebola epidemic in West Africa probably occurred because of bats, which carried the disease that were forced to move into new habitats because the forests that they used to live in have been cut down to grow palm oil trees. And this has been researched significantly, claiming that it was the trees that have caused more and more patients to have Ebola because of the move of bats. Now, the future risks are not easy to foretell because these are all basically based on research and patterns that we've been seeing over the years. But the reality is that climate change hits hard on so many different fronts that matter to where pathogens appear, including temperature, rainfall patterns, but to also it helps to limit the risk of infectious diseases when we do reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make sure that we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. However, getting that to happen at this time where we are right now seems almost impossible. Humans and wild animals face so many challenges for survival because of climate change, and more frequent, and intense droughts, storms, heat waves, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, warming oceans can absolutely directly impact us. Animals as well, where we live, it's going to cause and wreak havoc on people's livelihoods and communities. I'm not going to talk about how the US is in this place, but it's not a good place for the US. But the world, just in general, is in a problem situation. But overall, what I want to point out from all that slides is to point out that climate change is real. And you may be like asking, why? I know that it is real. Cool. I'm glad that you do and that you know it. The problem is there are people in our industry that still doubt that climate change exists. And that's where we have an issue. But before we do go into that, there's still some details you should note. So at this point, we're currently heading towards at least a 3 °C change. And globally, we are assuming that we will at least hit 2 °C at this very point. And yes, we do have, the Paris Agreement, which clearly defines that 2 °C as the upper limit for global warming, but also lists 1.5 Celsius as a more desirable goal because it reduces the risk of the worst outcomes for climate change. But I want to reiterate that we are on track to go beyond 2 °C by 2050. We are looking at 3 degrees and more if we do not make any changes right now. And if you're wondering, what would the difference look like, Chloe? Well, you got heat waves, fresh water, heavy rainfall, crop yields, sea level rise, coral bleaching. And you might be like, well, that's not too bad, right? Sure, I guess, but we're not at 1.5 right now, but we're about to be. And here's another way of looking at this. You can look at the loss of plants, loss of, insect species. I know you hate bees, but we need bees to survive. So we don't want to lose bees here. But also coral reefs getting bleached is a terrible situation for our, the life under our waters. But that extreme heat means that we will not be secure with food. That also means we won't be secure with water. So if we can't have food and water, and we don't have the ability to produce energy that is effective and clean, then we're going to have issues. The collective global goal under that Paris Climate Agreement is to prevent the rising global temperatures from increasing to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, but no more than 1.5 degrees as ideal. But currently, like I said, we are on track for almost beyond doubling that, a potential catastrophic of 3 degrees. So one way how you can look into this, if you don't believe me, because I am not a climate expert, I will be honest, my background is being a strategist and also InfoSec, but I am very much committed to wanting to make a difference when it comes to climate change, hence why I'm giving this talk. But if you want to double check anything, please take a look at the emissions gap report. There was one that just came out most likely this year. However, I have not read it, so I have read the 2021 one, and that one, it basically showcased that, our pledges will probably result a warming of around 2.7 degrees Celsius at this time. So if implemented effectively, net zero emission pledges could limit to a warming of 2.2 degrees Celsius, closer to the well-being of, that 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. But that means we need significant changes within the next few years and continuously. And so this report's really good to understand what is needed at this time. Now, when I brought up that whole climate change is real, the truth that I've shared with you, these are all backed up with facts from leading institutions on climate change, but also, the research institutions that are doing the work and the hard work of tracking everything. But the reality is that, why am I bringing this up at an InfoSec conference? Well, first, thank you, Hacktivity, for accepting this talk about climate change. It is a controversial talk in many other places around the world, including in the US a lot, unfortunately. But the reality is that we don't talk about climate change because of the political situation. And it's one of those things that, if we are always talking about risks and mitigating risks, security risks and all this stuff, and yet we never bring up climate change in those meetings, that concerns me, and it should concern you. In other words, we have executives who aren't doing anything or even considering the impact of climate change at this very moment. So many decision makers hush the subject and deny the science, which then leaves you with a wreckage when there is a flooding situation, or when we have incredible fires, or we have climate refugee situations happening at companies. We are not prepared for that because our employers are not prepared for it because they're not talking about it. And as a security team, we need to talk about that, right? And one thing I want to point out is that the industry that we're in uses a lot of electricity, including for computer data centers. If much of that comes from coal, to be honest, it creates this boatload of planet warming emissions. This is relatively an easy problem to solve if companies use renewable energy, which is expanding fast and getting cheaper. I would tell you that Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have also gotten attention for selling technology to help the oil and gas industry extract fossil fuels, which are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. However, Google has promised to stop doing this, believe it or not. The next thing to note is that it is possible for big tech companies, to help achieve that zero emissions. It is possible to do that, but we need them to be with us. what's happening is that we see a lot of tech companies actually preventing any change when it comes to climate change because they're worried that it will impact their business in a negative way. So because of that, then this is becoming an issue. Like when we try to have emission standards, we're going to have roadblocks. Both the UK and the EU now actually require their countries to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And that's bound to affect tech in every other industry because of these countries that are moving forward, or these unions that are moving forward to ensure that this is going to happen. Now, the reason I'm saying we aren't prepared for climate change impacting cybersecurity is also because what that means is we're going to have to start stepping up to protecting natural resources, such as water from attackers. That means this is a supply chain situation. So climate change provides us with plenty of risks and security issues in our supply chain because of climate change and what it can do. The shift of employees moving across the country and the world also does play a role. I don't know if you remember, but during the pandemic, all of a sudden working remotely was a little bit difficult for some security teams. So yeah, it's something we have to work on. But also the increase of weather damages does impact businesses, and also where your data is being stored. But also increasing pandemics also impacts businesses and creates security risks as well. And most importantly, in my opinion, additionally, is that how do we protect aid that's being delivered in areas that need it the most because of climate change? Because attackers may try going after it, such as funds or food, or even like survival blankets, water. There's a lot of different things. So the thing is, we need a plan, and we must plan, and we can do that. So don't think of this as doom and gloom situation. We absolutely have the ability to make a difference in our company and on our security team and our participation in the InfoSec community. So I'm going to give you some suggestions to prepare for the future, and I want to give a quick random fact, but for those that don't know about carbon dioxide, did you know that it can last about 1,000 years in the atmosphere? If anything, they think it can last for at least 1,000 years. But once again, we don't have the data back up that if it can go even longer than 1,000 years. So keep that in mind. Now, the first thing you can do is spread awareness of climate change. Let people know it's real, it's going to impact us, it's already impacting us. I don't know a single person where climate change has not impacted their daily life at this time. But one of the things you can do is to get your company to start using ESG frameworks and create annual sustainability reports. And I'm not talking about doing some greenwashing reports here, because that's not okay. That's never okay. But there are some that you can look into. So the TCFD I really like, because what it does is that it gets the board and also the leadership teams to think about what would happen to the business if we got 2 degrees Celsius warmer. Now, what about 3 degrees Celsius warmer, 4 degrees Celsius warmer? How will that impact our operations, our security teams, and our personnel, and also how we run our business? So by practicing these type of exercises and coming up with, incident response plans, see what I did there? That actually can help companies be able to be prepared for things such as, anything that climate change throws our way in the future. There are some other ones to look into to go for. Also, knowing your carbon footprint, believe it or not, is incredibly easy to note what your carbon footprint is. It is the one thing you can calculate with the ESG standards and frameworks that is incredibly easier to do than any of the other things. Knowing your carbon footprint is easy to track and to note. You can use that footprintcalculator.org for individuals, for companies. There's the GHGprotocol.org one, and they have this GHG emissions calculation tool that got released earlier this year. But knowing your waste is incredibly important, because you can note that plastic, you want to just reduce it, just overall. Don't assume it can be reusable, recyclable. Don't ever do that. Instead, keep reusing that same plastic item multiple times until it breaks down. And that's the same with a plastic bag. If you have one, use it multiple times. Don't throw it away. Just keep using it over and over. Compost if you can. Go trash free. It's a little bit controversial. You can't technically go trash free, but use reusable containers and bags. That can be helpful. Snacks in bulk. So instead of getting individual packets in your bulk items, get something in like one enormous bag with all your products in it. Also recycle glass and paper products because those things can be recycled always. Just make sure you rinse it out properly if you're using glass and also tin. Also buy less. Believe it or not, by buying less, you're actually saving the planet. Rethink conferences. So one thing to talk about is when we have conferences, to always have a hybrid version. Like right now, we have a hybrid version. I wish I could be there in person, I'll be honest. But hybrid versions do help in many ways because it can reduce transportation to the conference and away from the conference. GHG emissions in the US, it's like that highest contributing factor is transportation. Also known your CO2 emissions when you're making decisions when planning your conferences, knowing how much it's going to cost the environment by doing it and how you can start limiting those things. Also your food and energy source, that's important. I like to bring up energy source for people to know is like you can drive a Tesla, but if your Tesla is being powered by energy that comes from coal, you're not doing anything good for the environment by driving that Tesla. So always be aware of where your energy source, where is it coming from. I would dive into this part, but one thing quickly on here is that t-shirts at conferences. Let's talk about it really quickly. Most of the time there are plastic fibers in there such as Rayon and many other things. But remember, it takes about 400 plus years to decompose. The majority of your t-shirts that if you wear once or twice from this, when you got swag, gets thrown into the trash. Even if you do donate, chances are it's going to end up in a land waste because most of the time those items aren't reused again. They're actually sold or they're dumped into areas in developing places or illegal places. And if you don't believe me, let me show you why. If you don't know about this, take a look at it. Look into Chile and how all our clothes that you donate, not all of them, but a good chunk of them, or retailers that don't sell it, they send their stuff over to Chile and it gets dumped in here. About more than half of 60,000 tons of clothes imported each year ends up in illegal desert landfills with dire consequences for the environment and the local communities like we're seeing right here. But overall, what you can do is buy less tech. Invest in your devices, hold on to them as long as you can. If it's not broken, keep it. If they don't have any more updates on it, then maybe it's time to look elsewhere because we are in security and we like to have safe products. So if there's ever that, then that's the time when you would go about it. But, making sure that we really kind of go after copyright laws to ensure that we can repair the devices ourselves would be incredibly helpful and beneficial to our environment. So we don't have to keep replacing it whenever something is broken. But most importantly, I just want to point out there that most of the tech that we buy does have rare materials, and those rare materials are usually adults and children that are mining, and it's modern day slavery in many places around the world. So it is one of those things that every time you buy some equipment, you do not know basically the supply chain of how it ended up in your hand. So always be careful. If you cannot note what those things are, assume possibly the worst at times. So recycle programs don't really exist on here. So whatever you do buy, make sure that it lasts long, invest in it, and just keep it as long as you can instead of replacing it. And last but not least, here are all the things you can do to get involved at this time. So know your waste, get your companies on board with the ESG standards, or at least start that conversation, track your carbon footprint, ensure events produce low emissions and trash, volunteer and help protect our resources because there will be attackers out there, and this already has been happening. Them going after electricity, water, food, and all that in different places around the world. So we need to step up and protect our supply chain. Also, knowing to purchase less is the best thing you can do for the environment, just that and alone. And update yourself on climate change. Feel free to spread this talk as well. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you all so much for existing. My name, once again, is Chloé Messdaghi. That is my handle over there on Twitter. But you can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. Happy to answer any questions. My DMs are open. And thank you all for catching my talk on climate change. And I look forward to sharing more about that in our InfoSec community in the upcoming weeks and months. Thank you so much, Hacktivity, for having me, and have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye, everyone.